Wonderful. So we're back again for our last session of the day. Thank you all for sticking with us, and thank you all for the wonderful questions and everything so far. I'm Amy Edwards. I'm just chair for this session. We'll go as we have before with not lengthy introductions, just names, straight into papers, so we can leave plenty of time for questions. So first up, we have Seyward Darby, and she's going to be talking about Sisters in Hate, Women, Radicalization, and White Nationalism. So please take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. It's the end of a long day and the end of a long week. So thank you all so much for being here to listen to that topic. I am 8 months pregnant, and so if you see me grimace at any point, it's not because of a question or what my colleague here said. It is purely because something is picking me in the ribs. So please know that. I might be grimacing about the election, but it's like I didn't have a baby kicking thing. So as she said, my name is Seyward Darby. I'm not an academic. I'm a journalist, and I run a small magazine called The Atavist, which is, give a little plug, fantastic publication. We publish one long-form narrative nonfiction story a month. We're going strong, and the catastrophe that is media these days. And I also spent several years working on a book called Sisters in Hate. And I actually wanted to start with the genesis of the book. I don't have a formal paper to present. I'm just going to kind of talk through some of what I did, how I did the research, and some of my findings. And I actually think the genesis is quite interesting because it started quite literally on this day in 2016. Because I had managed to peel myself up off the floor and become a full human to a certain extent again. And I was really struggling with feelings of helplessness. And as a journalist, wanting to know, what can I do? How can I contribute? This is absolutely catastrophic. And I want to feel like I am both educating myself so I can better understand how we got here, but also doing something that feels constructive, productive for an audience. And this was right around the time that Richard Spencer, Nazi guy, had the, this is gonna sounds like a century ago, had a gathering of fellow white nationalists in DC, and there was the Hitler salute that happened, and this made headlines. And there had been for a couple of months, a lot of chatter and media coverage about the alt-right. And I was just really struck by, in every article that I read, it talked about angry white men. And it was kind of simple math in my mind. It was like a social movement cannot survive on men alone. So as much as they might wish that it could. And so where are the women, and why are nobody talking about the women? And this also coincided, of course, with the exit polls indicating the percentage of white women that had voted for Trump. And as a fun reminder, the majority of white women have not voted for a Democratic candidate since 1996. And before that, they had not voted for one since 1964, if I'm not mistaken. So what's going on, right? And so I just started looking for women who supported white nationalism. It was not hard to find them. There were lots of them out there, some of them adjacent to the Richard Spencers of the world, others not. And this led me to initially write a magazine article about what I was finding, and then eventually write the book, which came out in July of 2020. Super fun time to put a book into the world when you're not allowed to see people or touch people or whatever. So that's kind of the genesis. And I wanted to kind of talk about some of the key takeaways I found in the book, in the researching of the book, which I should say is organized around 3 women who their stories sort of serve as arcs within the book. And I spent time either with them, in some cases remotely talking to them, in some cases them refusing to talk to me because they decided that I was a hideous childless cat lady, jokes on them. And they didn't want to talk to me anymore. But anyway, their stories also then served as launch points for talking about historical findings, political science research that related to the topic. And so they were sort of conduits through which to really expand upon this question of why do women get involved in these movements, and how do they get involved in these movements, and what does their involvement look like? So the first thing I wanted to talk about was just how overlooked women have been in the history of white nationalism. It's genuinely shocking. I saw you go, shocking. I was like, I know. So, if we think about, and a lot of my research focused on the American context, but certainly in no small part because a lot of contemporary white nationalists are inspired in one way or another by Nazi Germany. I did a lot of reading around that as well. And it's time and time again, in these far right spaces, whether we're talking about, a ruling regime, something more fringe, women have been very heavily involved, prominently so. And then it's just like history forgets, which history forgets women all the time. So it's sexism in its own way. But just to give some examples, the Klan obviously started after the Civil War. The initial version of the Klan was highly vigilante. Women were not involved, and it was a fraternal organization. However, women were very much held up as the objects that the Klan was trying to protect. Then when the KKK, kind of went down for a while, came back up, had its big resurgence in the 1920s, the major force behind that was a woman from Atlanta who was basically a PR maven and helped the Klan build its national profile, also built a women's Klan that had chapters across the country. And they utilized the fact that women had just gotten the right to vote to their favor. And there's some wonderful books on this by Kathleen Blee, who is a sociologist at the University of Pittsburgh, and also some of the wider books about the history of the Klan will include, chapters about women. But it, again, I think if you ask the average person on the street, tell me what you think the Klan is, right? They're going to be like guys in hoods riding around with torches, not necessarily, networks of women taking care of each other's children so that the others can go vote for, racist policies in Oregon or Indiana or Maine or any of the number of other places in which they really had strongholds. And so there's also this incredible New York Times article from when the woman who, I always get this wrong, and I always say the name of a novelist instead of the name of the woman behind the Klan, and my pregnancy brain is really not going to help with this. So I'm not even going to try right now. She came to New York and was kind of feted by the media, like, oh my gosh, she doesn't wear robes, she wears gowns, and what play is she going to go see? And the New York Times article about her is situated right next to a story about a lynching in South Carolina, which is just, kind of this mind-boggling moment of something that we've seen time and time again, which is kind of the normalization of women in this space, or seeing them as somehow like less terrible, maybe because they're not necessarily the ones committing violence, although they do commit violence sometimes. So that's one example of someone who kind of got lost to history. And then to talk about Nazis for a moment, there was a whole apparatus of women in Nazi Germany, including kind of like a female Hitler. I mean, women weren't allowed to be as powerful as men, but they were very important in terms of propaganda surrounding Nazi ideals of the home, of motherhood, certainly of like, the wider National Socialist imagination, but really, these ideas, and eugenics is another example, like they were, very powerful advocates for that. There's one detail in Mothers in the Fatherland by Claudia Kuntz, a wonderful book about this era, about how women within the apparatus were given medals based on the number of children they had. And like if soldiers saw a woman with, I forget, what the particular medal was or whatever of that status, he was supposed to stop and salute, because it was like, you are creating children for us, right? And that was seen as highly, highly political act. Similarly, on the Eastern Front, and Wendy Lauer has written about this in her wonderful book, Hitler's Furies, women were much more intimately and actively involved in violence, whether that meant actually committing violence or supporting the apparatus that was committing violence in concentration camps, like on the actual front lines of battle. So, assistance, in some cases, wives, girlfriends, although I really hate the trope of like women get involved in this because they're wives and girlfriends. That's really, really like the biggest overstatement of all time. And one of the things Wendy talks about in the book is how after the war, these women quite literally got away with murder. In some cases, they were brought before a judiciary, to be held accountable, and they made a very good showing. They looked quite maternal, they looked contrite, and they were women. And so people just thought, well, there's no way they could have actually done these horrible things, or, what they did was far less bad. And so they were let off the hook. I'm obviously rapidly condensing this information. But that's another example of just, you don't hear about these women. We don't even know their names. There was also a woman in Nazi Germany who was one of the key researchers to talk about, I don't know where Dagmar is, but Romani children, to talk about, their intelligence and their inherent deficiencies. And she lived with them in an orphanage, not that they were all orphans, but that's where, some of these children had wound up. And they thought of her as quite a mother figure because she was talking to them all the time and asking them about themselves and testing them for things. And then when she was done with them, they were all deported and murdered. And she went on to work in like the German civil service in the 50s and 60s before she died. So again, just these examples of women being very prominent, and then they sort of get wiped from the way that we conceive of these horrific chapters in history. So I could go on and on about that, and this certainly stretches into, actually, I will give one more example. Sorry, this is a good one. So I was thinking about this recently. Ruby Ridge, which has been an incident that continues to really inspire a lot of people on the far right, this idea of like government failure, government betrayal, government meddling in people's personal lives. And, kind of the defining moment in the siege on Ruby Ridge was when Vicki Weaver was shot by a federal agent. And you can, if you have read anything, seen anything about Ruby Ridge, there's kind of these images that, or if you imagine what Vicki Weaver looked like, she's wearing like this all white sort of nightgown, like in the woods, sort of ethereal looking. And when she was murdered, it was like, oh my God, she was a wife, she was a mother. That's horrible. What is the US government doing? And then, obviously, again, inspiring to the far right. The thing about Vicki Weaver is that she's the one who converted her husband to like hyper Christian fundamentalism. She was actively involved in Aryan Nations meetings with her husband. She was not just this like passive person on the side who then of course became a symbol. She was a very, very relevant actor in, the things leading up to this incident. And another example in that case, not of someone who's been forgotten at all, but someone who's kind of been misshapen in history, and her agency lost, if you will. So those are some of the examples of the ways in which we've overlooked women. I could provide many, many more if you'd like, but I wanted to talk a little bit about radicalization, because I think that this is very much in the discourse this week. People are talking about, why doesn't the left have, liberal Joe Rogan? We're all worried about the young men and the podcast they're listening to, and what are we going to do about this? And seems important to talk about radicalization writ large. And I think, this was maybe for me the biggest revelation in working on the book, was just reading about radicalization, of which I will say study-wise, and this has changed quite a bit since I started my project, because a lot more people have become concertedly interested in understanding radicalization. But so much of the research pre-2016 was really focused on radical Islam, right? So this was all in contexts, not outside the United States necessarily, but very much not within the context of like white America. That's changing now. But one of the things that really striking about the radicalization process is how incredibly mundane it can be. That it's not, when I told people I was working on this book, and they were like, why do you need to know anything about what motivates these people? Like, they're just horrible racists. And I'm like, well, true, but they don't necessarily start out that way. And the reason and the ways in which the women I spent time talking to or otherwise researching, the ways in which they got to the point where they were like, we should be separated from other races, white people are superior, any number of, the sort of normal talking points in this space, they had felt powerless in some way. They'd felt like they didn't have a purpose. They didn't have a community. Some of them were new mothers who felt this way. A lot of them had actually dabbled quite a bit in left or, traditionally sort of like leftist spaces, and felt very alienated within them for one reason or another. And then they found almost exclusively on the internet, and I should say that the women I researched, some of them radicalized in like what do we call what comes after the aughts? The teens? Sure. The teens. But I also spoke to people who had radicalized much earlier, and even they were radicalized online in like the 90s and the aughts. So this is not just, a YouTube, Twitter, Rumble phenomenon. And they said, I found a person who was making videos that made me feel better about some of the feelings that I had and the choices that I made. And that became an on-ramp for feeling like this is the space in which I'm going to find purpose, community, power, in some cases money, because some of these, if they make their own channel, it gets monetized in some way. And I think that this is such a crucial thing that we sometimes forget when we're talking about people who ultimately are saying incredibly hateful things, is that is not in any way to excuse the hate, but to understand that they, in many cases, started from a place of not feeling that way necessarily, or if they felt it, it was tethered in some way. There's a wonderful study on radicalization that I cite in my book, and they talk about how radicalization is essentially the process of impulses like becoming untethered. And similarly, if you've been raised in a racist patriarchal society, you might have some of these impulses that have become sort of ingrained in you in one way or another, but you've been keeping them in check. And here you have somebody, we talked about permission earlier, obviously, like Donald Trump giving people permission to be cruel. And similarly, something happens in the space of radicalization where, you're told, it's not like, so what if you're scared of your neighbors because they're Black? Like, that's a normal thing to feel. And, some nice lady on YouTube is telling you that. And you're like, you know what? Yes, you're right. And so it becomes this feedback loop that really doesn't challenge those impulses in any way, just makes them feel natural. So radicalization, I think, I could talk about radicalization all day. I think so much more research needs to be done on radicalization. But I do think that typically when we talk about it sort of more widely in the public, people are more interested in what's happening to young men. And I think that's a huge mistake. In the last couple of years, we've seen the trad wife phenomenon become a really big deal in the United States. The number of young girls and women who are very obsessed with traditional lifestyle, aesthetics, and it's a performative thing, right? Like they have their TikToks or their YouTube channels or whatever, but they're swimming in waters right next to, in some cases, trad wives who are also just deeply, deeply racist. But also, neo-Nazis and other folks who believe very, very deeply in highly defined traditional gender roles. So this is to say, don't overlook the radicalization of women. So I want to talk a little bit about the roles that women play in this space. And I think that the first one is, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but the normalization of these ideas and sort of the softening of some of these ideas. One of the main sources and subjects in my book, Lana Laktef, who is a white nationalist who runs a white nationalist platform called Red Ice and has for a long time with her husband. She gave a speech not long after Trump was elected where she talked about I think she said, hard things are more palatable coming from soft women. And I think that really is, a nice summary in some ways of the way that women message ideas that are genuinely cruel and hateful, but they do it with a smile. They look maybe traditionally attractive. They aren't physically threatening. And they can also get away with saying, well, why are you criticizing me? Like, I'm just a wife and a mother, I'm just like sharing my thoughts, and they kind of hide behind their femininity at the same time that they are really normalizing some really hateful ideas. They also, and a segue from that is recruitment, because oftentimes, again, and this kind of goes with you don't, wake up hating, or you're not born hating people. And a lot of people don't get into this space because they actively hate other people. Women can serve as really important recruitment tools because they'll invite you into, I don't know, don't you just want to talk about hair and makeup? That's kind of like the YouTube, TikTok side of things. Or, in like a church religious space, we want to talk about the Gospels. We want to, kind of just drawing people in, making it feel very welcoming. And, again, that's an on-ramp, or those are several on-ramps. And women have traditionally served as very important recruiters. They also are symbols. Again, I mentioned the early days of the Klan. Women continue to be this idea of like, who are we fighting for? Who are we protecting from the criminals coming to our country, right? Who are we protecting from the trans menace? Like, women in this space continue to very happily inhabit that sort of role. It's more passive, obviously, but also very important. I think the other thing that fascinates me is how they make the domestic political. I think a lot of times people overlook women in this space in no small part because the things that they're interested in are having children, raising children, educating their children, creating a certain idea of hearth and home. And it's like, well, that's not politics. Not so, because if you're a pronatal movement that's obsessed with the future and making sure that you are defining gender norms, political norms, and kind of really, just defining so many things in the future. Like the home isn't necessarily political space. And I think that women serve a very important function by making the domestic political, and also letting people, women know you having children is important. Like that is important to our cause. It's not just like important for the population of the world or whatever. Like it's actually like important for us. And so it also makes people feel empowered to do things that our wider society often makes them feel disempowered for doing. I think I'm running up on my time. I did want to say just a couple more things. Like, I think that I don't want to overstate what we know from this election, but certainly the exit polls are quite similar on the white women front to what they were previously. I think he maybe lost a little bit of ground, and he did lose ground among white female college educated voters. But still, we're looking at a majority of white women who voted for him. And people, cited the economy, immigration as their most important issues. I think, those are not hegemonic issues. And some of what I've been talking about can be tucked inside of that. So, fear of physical harm, fear of or powerlessness, feeling like you don't have agency, you don't have a say. All of these different things can be tucked inside what are just 1-2 word issues. So I'll be very curious to, as people start to, not that polls are everything, but start to unpack things to really see how this all shaped up on the white women front. I will stop there.
Thank you so much. And then next we have Zahid Chaudhary, who's going to be talking about authoritarian freedom.
Well, I'll just take a moment to thank Stefanos and the organizers. And thank you all for being here. It's a beautiful day out there, Friday afternoon. So I wish I had something cheerful to offer to end our discussion, but I have only to offer resonances with all the other great conversations we've been having. So what I'm going to be presenting on today is what freedom means in the far right, and particularly looking at medical freedom and parental rights movements. And these movements in the US are predominantly activated by women. In the rhetorics of contemporary right-wing extremism in the US, freedom is a kind of totem for otherwise heterogeneous political action committees, conspiracists, lobbyists, online trolls, and activists. And first of all, I would say there isn't one iteration of what freedom means. And freedom does different kinds of work across these different kinds of far-right actors. While their emphases may shift, with some voices espousing anti-statism, and others emphasizing personal license above all, particularly the incels, by and large, the banner of freedom is what seems to mobilize many right-leaning people. The QAnon shaman's very familiar figure to us, sadly, is his insurrectionary howls in the Senate chamber on January 6, 2021, included animal sounds and the word freedom. Positioned somewhere between a war cry, a lament, and a prayer, the shaman would have the word freedom take on the eldritch powers of benediction, and in turn cast himself as a steward for the magic of the state. A stencil of his impassioned, horn-bedecked face with the word freedom written underneath it is available for purchase at his online store. Moms for Liberty, whose members eschew such outre performances, and you see they look quite disdainful, nevertheless organize themselves around the value of freedom. Founded during the pandemic in response to school closures, COVID restrictions, and mask mandates, the Moms for Liberty did come out of a sort of anti-vax, sort of anti-lockdown movement. That's when the Moms for Liberty was founded. Freedom for this group initially meant freedom to exempt oneself from collective responsibility. do not comply, which was the familiar cry of anti-vaccine and anti-lockdown protesters at the height of COVID-19 pandemic, became a governing principle for Moms for Liberty. Over time, this group changed its political mission by making rights and responsibility rather than non-compliance the center of its platform. So it shifts from a kind of a politics of disinhibition to a politics of rights and responsibility under the moniker parental rights. Yet their fight for parental rights entails the suppression of others, public school teachers, medical care providers, librarians, trans people, etc. Imagining themselves as the ultimate authority with respect to their children, parental rights advocates, of which Moms for Liberty is only the most visible and influential group, assume authoritative stances with respect to public education, medical treatments for trans youth, content of library shelves, and so on. Their politics thus operates in a double movement. Acting as the arbiters of morality, education, and traditional values, parental rights advocates call out for an ironclad authority that would secure their visions of the social order. The defiant and rebellious cry, in other words, of do not comply, has resolved into a wish for submission to a form of state authority that would ensure and protect parental rights, thereby making parents the ultimate authorities regarding children. The children are thus sequestered in this political imagination from the social altogether. Freedom for these and other political actors on the far right means everything from self-ownership, personal license, freedom from state regulation, and freedom to reinvent the terms of social responsibility. Under the sign of freedom, right-wing extremism seeks to violate public health ordinances, prevent women from having control over their reproductive health, ban books from public libraries, keep children from learning about histories of race and about sexuality, oppose gay marriage, introduce prayer into public education, and so on. Political theorist Wendy Brown has rightly dubbed this resurgent strain of freedom anti-democratic authoritarian liberalism. This is her term. She writes, I promise it's the only block quotation in my presentation. If classical liberalism's identification of freedom as a private individual good quietly ignored social powers of inequality, marginalization, and abjection that bear on its use, anti-democratic authoritarian liberalism is the political form converting liberty into a rabid defense of those powers. Divested from popular sovereignty, in particular, in democracy and democratization in general, and animated by the unprecedented social disintegration of neoliberalism, which we heard about earlier today, freedom within this form is more than anti-statist, it is anti-democratic, anti-political, anti-social, and sometimes anti-life. End quote. Indeed, as Brown notes, the history of notions of freedom is an exclusionary one. And earlier today, someone was saying that freedom is, we have to sort of handle with care this notion, and because people, and the reason is because the very history of the notion of freedom has always entailed some kind of exclusion, arguably reaching as far back as the Greek polis, in which free men were the subjects of freedom, but not slaves and women. The latter were instead people over whom freedom could be practiced as a kind of entitlement or power. Over time, freedom became riveted to the rights and practices of domination. The historical as well as philosophical entwinement of freedom with domination has been a central concern for recent thinkers, and I'll just briefly mention a couple. Tyler Stovall, Aziz Rana, Jefferson Cowie have variously parsed in detail how hegemonic notions of freedom rely on producing unfreedom for others, whether in the form of dispossession, slavery, withdrawal of civil rights, or political power. Wendy Brown contributes to these critiques by tracking how reactionary notions of freedom transforms it into a right of aggression against social mores, social protections, and social justice. Alberto Toscano, resident in the room at the moment, dubs this phenomena fascist freedom. An outgrowth of liberalism itself, he argues, it is a contemporary iteration of fascistic promises of freedom, complete with anti-statist rhetoric, often delivered by state agents themselves, that aims to deliver, and I quote Alberto, the promises of liberalism through illiberal means. So whether we call it fascist freedom, anti-democratic authoritarian liberalism, contemporary rhetorics of freedom that position themselves against social justice and social equality offer up the space of politics as an arena for psychosocial satisfactions, The key pleasure on offer entails the practice of freedom without accountability, responsibility, or any sense of one's dependence on the well-being of others. In short, such freedom is the promise of impunity as a glimmering hope of a fascist utopia. Here I have Tanya Paris. She's from a medical freedom group known as Moms for America. She's been very publicly vocal about the importance of doctors being able to prescribe ivermectin for COVID-19. Just so we're clear, ivermectin can actually eliminate COVID-19, but only in such high doses that would also kill the person along with the virus. So one must be truthful. In small doses, it is no better than a placebo. When asked by a journalist why she spent so much of her energy militating for a cure that is widely discredited, Paris responds, "It's about freedom. It's not ivermectin. The point is that the doctors should be able to prescribe whatever they feel the patient could benefit from." And a medical prescription expresses, in other words, a feeling, whether hunch or certainty, and freedom means not to have any legal barriers against rendering this feeling into medical assessment. What remains unspoken, possibly repressed by Paris, is that there's another feeling behind the doctor's sense that an alternate treatment is the right one. And this is a feeling Paris shares with the imagined doctor, feeling of paranoia, who a sense that established protocols of scientific inquiry are an elaborate plot for social control or maximal profits. Alliances between corporate and state entities, these alliances actually exist, surface in paranoid fantasy as the workings of a cabal. This feeling of paranoia and exposure is what underwrites the claims of medical freedom. In May 2023, Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis signed 4 medical freedom laws. This is what DeSantis called them. These laws blocked businesses or government offices from requiring vaccines or proof for post-infection recovery from COVID, as well as testing or mask wearing to gain entry or access to services. They also create protections for prescribing alternate treatments and expand exemptions for opting out of public health services. Erstwhile pro-choice slogans like "My Body, My Choice" are increasingly taken up by anti-vaccine movements, but unfolded in a more fully sketched libertarian political program. Here's a poster from Florida that describes the program succinctly. So after he signed these laws, DeSantis proclaimed in a speech at CPAC that, and I quote, "In Florida, we reject the biomedical security state, which erodes liberty, harms livelihoods, and divides our society. We've stood for freedom across the board, and the result has been Florida has defeated Faustism." Of course, he's invoking fascism. Florida has prevailed in the freedom has prevailed in the Sunshine State. For medical freedom activists, freedom operates in a double movement. Political action or the purchase of a dietary supplement are equivalent practices of freedom, and they also secure future freedom. And this is a double bind with which all calls for freedom contend. They assume that freedom is not yet realized, even as they hail a presumably free act of realizing it. So what binds one to this present and future freedom is the visceral conviction of knowing the truth. So there's a relationship to truth in this idea of freedom, and knowing the truth about the falsity of COVID vaccines' alleged efficacy, about the toxins legally pumped into our food and soil. And because freedom can be practiced by speaking that truth online, in courts, at medical board hearings, and one of the battles in Florida has been the taking over of hospital boards by medical freedom activists. So because freedom can be practiced by speaking such truth, it is as much a matter of will as veridiction. Moreover, truth-telling is a moral political practice, one that has a twofold effect. It endows a sense of superiority to the truth-teller, and thus authorizes the will to power that now feels like freedom. Hence, freedom can be opposed to science and to truth, because it has become the guarantor of truth. This is one of the questions that that led me to write this chapter in my forthcoming book, which is titled Paranoid Publics, that how is that freedom becomes a way to oppose science? And it's because freedom in this political imagination is actually connected to truth-telling. Protect freedom, reveal the truth, and the right to know, or the freedom to choose. These are phrases that are often twinned in right-wing propaganda. Libertarian investments, this is just from Moms for Liberty, we do not co-parent with the government. A classically libertarian expression. Libertarian investments in negative liberty, which is, say, freedom from external restraints, or from regulation, have turned paranoia itself into a kind of ethics. Insofar as paranoia is a form of defense, as Freud claimed a long time ago, it is conditioned on agonism, rivalry, and a readiness to fight or flight. While in contemporary cultural politics, it is commonly associated with the resurgence of conspiracy theories, it persists across a much wider spectrum of cultural politics. Feeling of dangerous exposure to forces outside of one's immediate control is central to paranoia, and this mood runs across widely different publics, from rising inequality to the steady withdrawal of the state's protections of citizens, austerity. The varied and devastating ravages of neoliberalism around the globe are pretty well documented. From this vantage point, which also includes scenes of catastrophic climate events, feeling of exposure to danger is actually a rational response to the social order. Paranoia is not the necessary outcome of these experiences, but it is both a sign of vulnerability and also a defense against it. And this is one of my main points, so I'll just repeat the sentence one more time, that paranoia is not the necessary outcome of this feeling of exposure and vulnerability created by the neoliberal order, but it is both a sign of vulnerability and also a defense against it. Among its attractions is that it lends a name to the unnameable, whether or not such designation corresponds to reality, the deep state, elites, governmental overreach, to which correspond the political and psychosocial values of freedom, truth, and self-ownership. Cultivating the latter, freedom, truth, and self-ownership, ensures protection against the former, deep state elites, the government. But more importantly, freedom practiced as an ethics of paranoia makes the original paranoid fantasy real, so to speak. It sutures the rift between psychical truth and historical truth. Political action in real life, or as the kids call it, IRL, aligns psychical and historical truth. Additionally, the collective nature of political action secures the truth because such action is shared. So what political actions do advocates of medical freedom take? The ideal action is to help to enact laws that would curtail governmental regulation of medical treatments. In the absence of such laws, there are additional political strategies. So you can attend and disrupt meetings of the boards of public hospitals, since these boards are imputed to have ulterior motives. Second, you could aim to get elected to these boards to change hospital policy and make way for truth in policy. Protest in front of vaccine providers, legally challenge the basis of medical licensing protocols, work to expand the exemptions, religious or medical, already in place for vaccines or other treatments. Become a digital warrior and spread the truth about established medical treatments. What interests me are the social, emotional, and the material satisfactions that the ethics of paranoia offer, and the particular kind of politics it generates, insofar as it installs a malevolence whose existence is proclaimed to be simultaneously irrefutable, the cabal or the big pharma, and yet must be confirmed through perpetual watchfulness. Paranoia is a feeling invested in revealing and truth-telling. Eve Sedgwick once described paranoia as knowledge in the form of exposure. References to truth abound in situations and contexts given to paranoia. The alt-tech social media platform launched by Donald Trump and from which he held forth about the stolen election, witch hunts, is called Truth Social. Project Veritas, which I'm sure some of you know about, is the name of an extreme right-wing, right activist group that distributes misleading or fake videos of undercover operations, so-called, to undermine progressive causes. Playing the truth teller is one of the central pleasures offered through participation. Truthing is the equivalent of posting in Truth Social's parlance, and its rhetoric suggests that everything else is a lie. Truthing an alternative fact is both a form of political participation and it calls out for political participation. The same dynamic applies to mainstream social media platforms as well, which were the first to perfect the art of online incitement. Once again, political participation confirms the truth when such participation is collective and shared, as with Project Veritas and various QAnon fora, on Truth Social or Gab or Telegram or other alt-tech platforms, paranoia enters political practice as a conduit to certainty. But this certainty is not one grounded on factual truth, which, as Hannah Arendt argued long ago, is in perpetual conflict with the realm of politics. Politics, for its part, might seek to marshal factual truth for its own instrumental ends, or efface it altogether for the sake of these same ends. That's from Hannah Arendt. In another insight that continues to resonate with our politics now, Arendt notes that, and I quote, "Factual truth is no more self-evident than opinion." And this may be among the reasons that opinion holders find it relatively easy to discredit factual truth as just another opinion. What binds people to their opinions usually entails psychodynamic operations, an aspect of the social order that Arendt was not interested in analyzing. Reality is derealized when belief receives priority over fact and feeling priority over knowledge. Belief differs from opinion because it carries with it the force of self-certainty. It is a means of one's orientation in the world, and thus conditions social and political conformance in it. Seeking the truth in an ethics of paranoia consolidates identity in the same speech act that anticipates an expansive future of negative liberty. But where medical freedom advocates are concerned, libertarianism as a political tendency does not quite capture all that is politically at stake for these movements. While their political rhetoric espouses the cornerstone of libertarian thought, individualism, notions of self-ownership, individual choice, self-sovereignty, negative liberty, that individualism is overtly expressed as a concern about the social bond between parents and children, and the social regulations undergirding societal reproduction. It is about parental rights, about the nuclear family, when we talk about Moms for Liberty in particular, and about family values. It is not accidental that so many medical freedom organizations, and the reason why I'm thinking of these two movements together is because it's the figure of the family that's important both for medical freedom activists and for Moms for Liberty. So the family is a flashpoint, and that connects these politics. It is not accidental that so many medical freedom organizations operate under some version of a moniker to do with moms. Moms for this, moms for that. In other words, there is indeed a vision of the social, of relation, of interdependency at the basis of these political movements, and the mom has become a bearer for neoliberalism's moral charge. She is first and foremost a moral subject whose needs and wishes align with truth, whose desires themselves render her actions true, since she presumably aims at bettering the lives of her children and the children of the nation. Her love for her children is the basis of her authority as a truth teller. As such, her needs are self-evident and already implied in the appellation mom. All of her demands, therefore, are to be deemed legitimate because they're grounded on the truth of a mother's love. Her desire, assumed to be focalized around family and children, asserts itself as a surrogate for everyone's common interest. If her desire is destructive and entails things that you were talking about, for example, banning books from public libraries, demonizing healthcare providers, subverting democracy, et cetera, then such negativity is in the service of preserving her family, a goal legitimized by the fact of being a mom. As such, the mom inhabits a hallowed space in cultural politics. She is exceptional, and yet she represents the norm. She is simultaneously a privileged subject, and yet she speaks for the demos. The freedom-fighting mom, who tends to refer to herself these days as warrior mom, is accountable only to her family, even though she seeks to govern the conditions of education or medical treatments for all other families. Because her actions and statements concern the family, the mom may mobilize individualizing language of preferences, wishes, desires, and dislikes, yet she never speaks as an individual, even when she expresses individualist ideas. As Melinda Cooper has argued, modern capitalism creates and reanimates certain forms of solidarity and love while pathologizing others. The family, in her account, is charged with overseeing the protection of individuals. The shifting of values from the state to the traditional nuclear family under neoliberalism has entailed coercive expectations of gender conformity and a renewed valuations of the social reproductive roles for moms and mothers and wives. For far-right female influencers, these roles now include the normalization of extreme political positions and the politicization of heretofore neutral online spaces. For example, a reel on how to fold fitted sheets also can serve as a warning against vaccines, or a cooking video becomes an occasion for opining against minorities. In the political imagination of this paranoid ethics, parental rights are under threat everywhere, with the state poised to usurp parental or medical authority. Sorry, that was a pledge. I meant to show that earlier. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up. Okay. So in medical freedom movements, the search for legal exemptions to whatever official policy is being contested is a very important goal, whether it's vaccines or masks. Until the law can be abolished, this logic goes, it must be exploited, that it need not apply to oneself, even if it applies to others. While neoliberal discourse about family values had hailed the nuclear family as a means of punitive protection, the discourse on parental rights intensifies this to the point of perversity. The family becomes a means of opting out of the social altogether. The family is itself a zone of radical exemption. Being exempted and being exceptional too feels like freedom. Indeed, and actually I'm going to just skip down a little bit. So while such exemptions might seem to operate at the level of the individual, they systemically favor some populations over other. In a way, this search for exemptions is actually, I feel like this politics is on to something very important, that there is something rotten at the heart of the operations of the law, especially after the Dobbs decision, we see that. That's if you're a white woman, you're able to still you have the capacity to still get an abortion, and if you're not, you don't. So there's something about this politics that understands that about the law, and it's already it's unfair nature even when there are no exemptions made, and yet this politics is always aiming at an exemption. Okay, so wrapping up, the medical freedom advocates fight in part for white freedom may not be entirely clear to them, but it becomes evident as a central political contradiction most medical freedom groups inhabit, where a strictly libertarian viewpoint would oppose state regulation of individual health choices, thus protecting the choice to have an abortion. Medical freedom organizations that engage the issue at all uniformly oppose the right to abortion. And this is my last bit. How to characterize the freedom imagined by these movements? A fundamental sense of vulnerability to governmental control, to environmental hazard, underwrites as politics that in turn proliferates vulnerability for others by exposing them to diseases that vaccines seek to eradicate. The freedom these movements offer promise self-mastery, even as it requires the installation of an implacable authority, whether family or law, or family upheld by law, that would ensure the exposure of others to violence or to illness. Destruction of others and of oneself are intertwined psychosocially here, but if this politics appears to be a literal-minded movement of the death drive, it is equally the case that the death drive lives in the operations of its existing law itself, most readily the recent Dobbs decision. Far-right discourse on freedom shares a similar fantasy to other death-driven politics, from the proponents of accelerationism to preppers. It imagines world catastrophe as a cleansing process, one in which one's own survival is secured through an assumed exemption. The law does not apply to oneself, and yet the law, whatever form it takes, is both necessary and ironclad. Medical freedom's embrace of its cherished truths about ivermectin, about parental rights, about the dangers of big pharma, is at the same time a wish to outlive the coming catastrophe by hastening it. Thank you. Sorry if that was so.
Okay, perfect. So what I'll probably do is take 2 or 3 questions in a go, and then you can respond to whatever
Great.
speaks to you from that. So, anyone want to start? Yeah.
Elaborate on the death drive.
Yeah, I'd just like to hear a bit more about the relationship between radicalization process and the usage of religion in that process, and just kind of where you see any type of discrepancy between radicalization and, I guess, not to be too glib, but like increasing religious affiliation. What is there a difference or?
Perfect, and we'll take one more. Have you hand up? Yeah.
Thank you. So for you, I thought that was fascinating, and I was trying to think through it. I guess my question would be, what is the basis for your critique of the concept of authoritarian freedom, and how deep do you want it to cut? In the sense that one way I could try to interpret what you were saying was that authoritarian freedom is not really freedom. And therefore, the basis for the critique is an immanent critique. Actually, it contradicts it. If you develop its logic, it's not really freedom, and that's the critique. Another more troubling for me hypothesis would be that what you're saying is that there's something wrong with freedom itself, that it has to be handled with care, and therefore maybe we don't like freedom that much, or handling with care might actually mean it needs to be allied with other things. So I don't know, do you want to ditch freedom entirely? Do you want to mix it with other things, or are you just saying this is not freedom?
Go ahead.
First one is you, death drive?
Why don't you guys go first?
I'll go first. Yes, you gather your thoughts. So I think the question, well, I will just say there was a fabulous essay about Death Drive really quickly by Patrick Bansfield. I always, do you know what I'm talking about? Yes. Blanchfield, thank you. Oh, gosh, pregnancy brain. Also, her name was Elizabeth Tyler, not Ann Tyler. That's the issue anyway, he wrote a fantastic essay about Death Drive. The publication is escaping me, but if you were to Google Patrick Blanchfield Death Drive, it's an incredible essay. Radicalization and religion. So I think this was another sort of assumption that a lot of people had when I started working on my book. They were like, oh, well, they must all be very Christian, right? They must be fundamentalist Christian. And I think that it's important to take a step back and realize just how motley the far right is. I mean, I know I had someone talking about Wotanism earlier. There were believers in Wotanism who I spoke to. And, you know, some people are outright atheist. I mean, I know Lana Lockteff is someone who kind of doesn't believe in any religion except, I guess, you know, faith in the white race. And so I think that the radicalization can happen in like church networks, and certainly in iterations of the far right past, that has maybe been even more prominent. I think it is happening now, but it's by no means the only place or even the predominant place where it's happening. So many of these, you know, women who especially kind of function as public faces, influencers, recruiters, they can often be quite deft at making it feel like you're welcome no matter what, basically so long as you're white. Even then, sometimes if you're not white, they don't really care. They just want people who are like-minded. And so there's a lot of like, you don't have to believe in our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. You know, you don't have to really believe in anything if you don't want to. We, you know, are operating from, again, and I think your presentation, these are all women I've thought so deeply about, you know, we're operating from a place of feeling like you have a say over your life, you have control over your children, and choices about your children. And that, again, that can be informed by faith or not. So this is a very long way of saying it's hard to quantify, but I do think it's a mistake to assume that that is like the primary on-ramp or conduit for a lot of these women, because at least in my experience, spending a lot of time watching YouTube videos where, you know, you start by making an apple pie and then by the end you're talking about the Muslim invasion of Europe and you're like, wow. But point being, like, that person, you know, the hook was the pie, right? The hook wasn't religion. So definitely an on-ramp, but not the sole one nor the prominent one.
So elaborating on the desk drive, the thing about the desk drive that interests me with respect to these topics is that the fact that in its operation, sometimes the desk drive seems to operate by veiling itself as pleasure or as espousing of politics or going out and getting petitions, getting signatures for a petition to put you on a hospital board, so that your family can take ivermectin next time they have COVID, right? So what interests me about the desk drive is exactly the fugitive way in which it operates. But I also think the desk drive doesn't explain everything about this, which is why I invoke it, but it's not the part of this argument that I feel really captures all of what's happening here. But that's where I would want to think the desk drive. It interests me that the iteration of freedom for medical freedom advocates, parental rights advocates, takes the form of political organizing and a lot of work and a lot of boring bureaucratic work, whereas freedom for incels and for other kinds of far-right politics is just about personal license. And so I think I would be curious about two different ways in which the desk drive might be operating there. But once again, I think it doesn't capture everything about these politics. Freedom itself, I don't want to give up on it. But I think what I am saying here is that the reason why freedom can be mobilized in this authoritarian way is because historically freedom itself has a very exclusionary history. Even in those moments, especially sort of 19th century liberalism, where, you know, it's supposed to be finally some kind of manifestation of freedom happening, you know, in governments and state policy, is still quite exclusionary. So I think the way we receive the notion of freedom has been too captured by a liberal genealogy. And I think if we ought to think about supplementing it with other ideas like responsibility and sort of networks and collectivities. And I think that would be the way to reclaim freedom. But that's work that remains to be done.
We're doing equality and fraternity.
Oh, well, okay.
Yeah, we have one here and then one here. We'll go for those two. Oh, and then one right at the back. Perfect.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the sort of relation between care and control, or sort of care and license, and particularly about something I'm hearing across a lot of talks today, which is the weaponization of the role of caregiver as sort of a basis for authority. And then how that might be, I don't know, like in relationship to the long history of sort of paranoia as actually a modality of care. And I'm kind of curious to hear you spin out how that might relate to issues with care that have come up in earlier talks today. So in Dagmar's talk, the young men who would rather die than be in a position to have to receive care, the inability to actually tolerate care, so to sort of move to different positions within this matrix of roles. And then also particularly the rise of, like, I don't know, the vast expansion of alienated care work, and the demand for that and the social devaluation of that labor.
I should have asked people to introduce themselves, so sorry, could I just catch your name?
Lily Shirless, yeah.
Perfect, thank you. And then introduce yourselves as you ask your questions.
I'm Caitlin Zaloom, anthropologist, and I'm really interested in the relationship between the family and the state, which we tend to, I mean, you know, like Melinda Cooper, among others, who think of like of a sort of demand for neoliberal demand within neoliberalism for a family-based form of care. But like if you talk to historical sociologists, the idea that the family was actually the foundational unit of the state, not one that was sort of incidental to it or oppositional to it, was really a kind of fundamental part of American history. I mean, if you just think about like how settlement worked, it was essentially through family units. So so I guess I'm wondering how you're seeing that relationship to the state today within these far-right movements, which are both oppositional and also not oppositional, maybe looking in some ways to return the state to something subordinate to the family unit rather than the other way around. At least that's what I'm hearing around like these debates over what schools can teach, about what teachers can or cannot, instruct children to know. So I'm wondering how you see that relationship between family and the state evolving.
Perfect, we'll just take the last question.
Yeah, it was a question principally for Zahid, though it also relates to the previous talk too. It's really about, I was kind of thinking a little bit about the that figure of the doppelganger that Naomi Klein uses, that vis-a-vis the pandemic, right? It's really in order to maybe problematize the notion that this authoritarian freedom is as such anti-democratic. One of the things that seemed very evident already at the time was the way in which in many places, not everywhere, but in many places, a reaction or response to what was deeply anti-democratic, deeply invasive, and in some cases deeply unjustified about some of the public health measures taken in the context of the pandemic, was left purely for right-wing consumption, right? I mean, this is one of the reasons why Giorgia Meloni is Prime Minister of Italy, right? The only one who opposed the particular way in which these things are being managed. And so, yeah, so I was kind of wondering about that like, popular and populist and also conspiratorial kind of right-wing critique of biopolitics, so to speak, and how, and the invisibility of a left I remember there were moments, even in Italy, like for instance, when there was that horrendous and epidemiologically idiotic notion that people had to be kind of like, immediately buried, nobody could have funerals, etc. I remember in Rome, this old kind of anarchist militant died, and the people refused the injunction and had a funeral because they were like, well, we should have funerals, etc. Or not, not allowing people to see their dying relatives, all of these things, right? And so I was just kind of struck about, the ways in which those forms are also feeding on a much more inchoate and an ambivalent sense of disaffiliation and distress about a very, very invasive and not particularly redistributory and not particularly emancipatory visions of care, right? And as by contrast with the way in which the left critique, so to speak, of these forms just became sort of invisible, which I think has given has given massive strength to the idea that the only anti-state and countercultural form comes from the far right in a lot of places, right? And that seems to me to have been a really big dereliction of progressive duty, so to speak.
I'll start by, okay, taking up the question of care a bit. So, I mean, I think that there are kind of a couple of threads I want to try to address. One is the social devaluation of care, and I think that is at least in my experience, like in my research, like a wildly important issue, where a lot of women, especially women who were mothers or wanted to become mothers, felt like that work was being devalued. Now, who is it really being devalued by, right? Like, that's the question. A lot of the women who I spent time, there was actually one of my main subjects, her name's Ayla Stewart, not her real name, but she changed it, whatever. Something to do with the moon. She, really started out as like a left-wing mommy blogger, and was very obsessed with unassisted birth, which was a new term to me. Now being pregnant, what? But this kind of idea of like, I really want to be able to choose, even if it may seem extreme to other people, the kind of care I give myself, I give my children. And she was in this very lefty kind of space, getting a master's in women's spiritual studies, I believe was the name of the degree. Even by then felt, she was being alienated. Now, ultimately, if we take a step back and think about who here is devaluing care, right? It's institutions and social structures that, wildly undervalue the labor of caregivers. We can talk about parental leave, we can talk about, family leave, any number of things. People are wildly underpaid for being caregivers. There aren't enough caregivers. Putting people into care facilities is prohibitively expensive for so many people. You can just go on and on and on. And so, the answer is capitalism, basically. Capitalism and patriarchy, to sum it up probably glibly, but that's okay. But the way that these women have responded to the social devaluation of care is by looking more closely, right? So, that woman who is more liberal than I am told me I'm not liberal enough in some way in my care or my choices of care, or, feeling like it's a misplacement, right, of responsibility for what is a very real issue. And then again, they get validated within these communities who are like, yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, the problem is, these liberals who want you to care more about immigrants coming into this country or about, girls becoming boys than your choices about the care you want to provide. The bottom line is, human nature wise, it's so much easier to, be mad at something that's right in front of you, or that somebody has said is right in front of you, than thinking, more widely about, the way capitalist systems are crushing you. Or the way that, for as much as we like to talk about as a country, we love mothers, the figure of the mother, we actually treat mothers horribly, right? And so I think there's like a real paradox there and a real tension where there's a very real issue with social devaluation of care, but then there's a misplacement of responsibility. And I was gonna say something else, but I want you to give your
That
thoughts.
was very helpful. So I was gonna respond to Caitlin Alberto briefly. But family in the state, you're totally right, Caitlin. This is, the parental rights discourse is about giving the family rights against the state. And I think the Melinda Cooper narrative, which is an account of neoliberalism and the rise of the discourse of family values, and she argues that the family becomes a site of care rather than the state. And this was a new, and so I think what I'm looking at is a next historical turning, which is that the state abdicates its functions of care, devolves it onto the family. Now, family is now being argued to be the grounds to demolish the state in some way, or to at least make the state more authoritarian to protect the family's authority. And so in some ways, I think there's a historical turning after the ravages of neoliberalism that interests me here. So I agree with you there. Alberto, yes, I think by the end of your question, I felt like you helped us answer it. Because you're absolutely right, depends on, there's nothing intrinsically anti-democratic about medical freedom movements, but all of their programs are fairly anti-democratic. They resolve into basically say, they also now want to want the state to outlaw certain kinds of medical research as well, for example. So you're right, in some ways the left at that moment of lockdown, there wasn't enough of a left narrative about how that this is unjust to certain kinds of workers. And the left didn't have a language for grasping a kind of democratic way to be against some of the pharmaceutical interests that made a lot of money out of COVID, absolutely. But I think that then these other folks have resolved into the completely right-wing politics around those same experiences. And I do think it's anti-democratic.
Anything, you said you might have something.
Oh, I was just gonna, sorry, I wanted to make sure everybody got their question answered. One of the things I was really struck by, and I sort of alluded to this in part of what I was saying, but I wanted to dig into it a little bit more, is this idea that care has become like, in the far right, particularly female imagination, it's very tied up with anti-feminism and this idea that feminism as a force has actually like made us soft as a culture, as, you know, political entity, and, you know, has made it such that we're like, everybody come within, you know, our borders, everybody, like, we will take care of you. And then saying that's the problem. The problem is that you're trying to be a caregiver to people I don't actually care about. And I want license to only care about what I want to care about. And that can be me, that can be my family, that can be, you know, a slightly bigger community, that can be a race. And so I think that there's also this very interesting, almost like anthropomorphizing of like the state as this like weak feminist entity that is misplacing care in a different way, right? And this was something I heard over and over and over in a lot of different contexts. This idea that like the liberals and like the liberal state which is, I mean, just wild to think about, you know, what our actual like immigration policies have been and whatnot, you know, under liberal presidents. But this idea that like care is incredibly important. It's not only being devalued, you know, individually to me, it's also being like misused and abused by this, you know, apparatus. It's a really, really fascinating thread to like follow through some of these, whether you're talking about videos or, you know, social media posts or tomes that have been posted on blogs. It's like, I think you could do a whole study just that. It's really, really fascinating.
Any more questions? We'll take a last round of three. So I had 1, 2, and then 3. And don't forget to introduce yourselves.
I'll go Teocino, leader of the Democratic faction inside the Democratic Party, Social Democrat of America. Question for Zahid and say, but actually, I am part of the movement, a movement that is democratizing the boring paperwork that you're talking about by the medical freedom people. And I have talked to them to get them on the ballot for municipal, because my take is I'm tired to deal with your shit. Go talk to the people, get the vote, and from the vote, you'll get an idea of how many people follow you. And then build your program. So I witnessed those people, and actually women who goes, we need to be on the ballot and blah, blah, blah. And suddenly they don't have a platform. They don't have anything. And suddenly they discover the medical freedom. Oh, that's what we want. And they go out and they start, and you start seeing individual women, and they get their men too, and suddenly starting building a program. And suddenly, once they get on the ballot, the media amplify, but who they are individually is not what the media turn out to be. I don't know if you see that. But my question is more towards the government, because getting on the ballot is to become the government. And within the Black community and the white community, there is a different sense of being in the government. And for example, in NYCHA, in public housing, people tell me, we're in public housing. We don't believe in the government. This is our housing, but it's not the government housing. And I'm like, so my question is, how do I answer those people who are telling me they want to be in the government, but they're not the government, but they're in the government? And at the end of the day, they end up on the ballot, and there is no answer from the left. Like you said, there is nobody there. So my question is that, how do I get the government, and how to see why those people who are less together when they have so much disparity and get to come out with the platform medical freedom? That's, it's crazy to me.
Then here at the front.
Oh, Tina Grossman. Well, I think it would be really interesting to sort of go into greater detail about the long-standing left tradition around medical freedom, right? I mean, anti-vax movement, immunization, certainly distrust of, the medical system, feeding into life's, Lebensreform, Dagmar knows all.
We're even feminist, our bodies ourselves.
So, right, so exactly. So, I mean, all the ways in which, there are these strange convergences that we have trouble confronting, right? Exactly, in our own traditions as well. So I think that is something we need to maybe talk about more. And then I just had this very sort of seemingly very obvious and simple question that came up sort of in terms of the different spaces of organization and disruption that you were talking about, whether you discern some sort of difference, meaningful difference between all of this activism online, right, versus the more sort of, direct physical manifestations like disrupting a school board meeting or, trying to, gain control of, a hospital board or those type of actual, IRL activities. I mean, I think this is the larger question, of course, about social media, digital lives, et cetera. But, in your concrete examples, whether
And then the last question at the back, a chance for you both to respond, and we'll head towards the end. So thank you.
I don't know whether it deserves to be the last question, but I'll go ahead anyway. Thank you both for your talks. What my question is to you, and I'm curious about two things with regard to the women and their radicalizing. So as you mentioned, yes, there continue to be very large proportion of women who do vote for Republican candidates, and in this case, Trump. And I wonder what proportion of that would you say belong to the far right or have been radicalized, or is this just that traditional Republican affinity and, for the basic policies? And my second question is, Was there a divergence among the women that you talked to and wrote about in terms of age? Any ethnicity in the difference, any class differences? I'm very curious.
Perfect, if you just want to respond to one or two things each, and then we'll head to the end.
Sure.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm a terrible organizer. I've never been good at it. I don't know what to tell these folks, but I think one of the things that it seems to me that we talked about earlier today is that people are looking for ways to participate and be in a community. So if there's a way to reframe the state or the political for people through understanding of that kind of participation, is my very weak response to you, because I'm definitely not an organizer. I wish I were. And yes, I think the sort of left tradition of medical freedom is extremely important. And I worry that at the moment, a lot of the people who are sort of coming out of that thinking are increasingly heading towards this other rightward direction. So, you know, a bunch of yoga practitioners who voting for Trump, et cetera. It's a real problem, actually. It's another way in which we need a more robust left voice now to actually address these questions. Was there another question as well?
The differences
In
between
real life
social media
versus
and-
digital.
Oh, yes, yes. What was the exact question about that, though?
Well, whether you discern a sort of meaningful difference.
Oh, yes, yes.
in
There,
those two.
yes, thank you. There actually, I do think you have a much more nuanced understanding of this in your account of radicalization, which the way I understand it is that that's where this switch happens between being, you know, like a full or an online presence and actually doing something in the street. And the way I've always understood radicalization is when you make that switch, when it's not purely in the realm of fantasy.
Right. Yeah, and for me, like radicalization has to do with the evolution of the thought process. And, you know, I mean, I think first of all, I do think that in some ways the conversation right now about, you know, podcast, social media and like what it's done to us is a little overblown. But I also think that, you know, you have to reckon with the fact that social media and in real life are not these clear, you know, distinctions, right? Like so many people, I mean, particularly during the pandemic, like lives happened online. You know, people engaged online. And so I think like, you know, really defining what we mean between those, what the difference between those things is really important. I actually don't know exactly. And yeah, I mean, I'm a millennial, and so like I spent a lot of my life online. And you know, I never took what these people were saying to somehow be less, or you know, what they were promoting to be less meaningful because it was online as opposed to, you know, in the streets. That being said, you know, one of the women, Ayla Stewart, who I mentioned, she was the only woman who was supposed to speak at Charlottesville, then she didn't because violence erupted and things got crazy, and she gave her speech on YouTube about, you know, she had to protect herself from, you know, the ravages of the left, even though we all know what happened in Charlottesville. Point being, like, there are some people who don't want to translate, right, from online to the real world. They would really prefer to keep focused on their intimate sphere, particularly with women, like focused on the family, focused on the self. But there are plenty of people for whom, and voting, right? Like voting is not something, it's an IRL action, but it's not like a public facing IRL action. That being said, I mean, you know, plenty of people are willing to translate what they've absorbed online into action, whatever that means. And that can mean, you know, joining a Moms for Liberty group. That can mean becoming a mass shooter. That can mean, you know, showing up at Charlottesville, any number of things. And I guess this is a long way of saying, like, I think it's really hard to say there is a difference. And I think that's increasingly something we have to reckon with, like, across, not just with this conversation. And then I will answer your questions. Thank you so much for those. What portion belongs to the far right? Gosh, I wish I could give you an answer. One of the great challenges of studying this space is quantifying. But I do think, you know, certainly there are white women who are you know, voting in some more sort of traditional, this is who I've always voted for, like I'm a Republican, whatever. I think what we really have to reckon with is the fact that all of those people, what is it, like 53% we think of white women at this point, who seem likely to have voted for him, all of them, or at least a large portion of them, are absorbing far-right messages, because far-right messaging has, even in the course of, like, I followed a couple of ideas that initially like started out on like Stormfront or, you know, another, I don't know, Andrew Anglin's Daily Stormer, or, you know, other like really, really hard right spaces. And you could track how they started to like make their way through, you know, I don't know, the Breitbarts of the world. And, you know, then got to Fox News and then made their way into, you know, mainstream Republican talking points. And so, you know, I think the question of who is a member of, you know, the far right, I think thinking about hard numbers is actually less important than thinking about how messaging and talking points have actually shifted further and further and further right. So what is influencing anybody to make that decision in the voting booth is being informed by what, you know, once upon a time was maybe more confined to the right. I mean, I'll give a quick example. We just ran in my magazine, totally unrelated to all this, a piece about how essentially a small community in rural Maine ran a neo-Nazi out of town. They found out that he'd come and he'd bought like 20 acres of land, and he was gonna, like, neo-Nazis before him, try to build a compound where, you know, he could train other people to save the white race. And basically this town was like, get out. And it's a really, really good story about collective action. And what's interesting is in the course of working on it, the writer and I, you know, we were kind of trying to follow him. Like, he since left Maine because he'd been run out of town. It turns out that he and his little Nazi group were among the first, like, very like vehement promoters of the idea that Haitians were eating pets in Ohio. And weeks before Trump, you know, brought it up at the debate, one of them like crashed a town meeting and threatened violence because, you know, oh, you've let these Haitians into town. And I think that's, I mean, the very small and also very quick example, but like of an idea that, you know, kind of started over here, and then you see it start to trickle in, and suddenly it becomes, you know, national news. And so I think following ideas as much as trying to figure out, well, what number of people believe Hitler wasn't a bad guy are we talking about? So that's question one. Question two, divergence. Oh gosh, do we have to stop?
Unfortunately.
Divergence.
In which case-
I know I talk a lot. I'm so sorry.
No,
My
you're
parents
good.
didn't make me say word for a reason. It turns out. No, divergence. It's such a great question. And I will say that for the purposes, I'm not an academic, but I tried to kind of think of this as some kind of anthropological study that I was doing. All three of the women I follow in the book were born in the first 3 months of 1979. And that was kind of part of what I wanted to do, was track their trajectories. And they radicalized at different points. One of them like 10 years before the others. But I was genuinely curious to kind of see how this happened. So that's a long way of saying that there, to a certain degree, I was kind of trying to keep, at least with my main subjects, like divergence to something of a minimum. Two of them went to college. One of them dropped out, the other finished, got that master's degree I mentioned. The other, I don't know if she ever went to college, but she ultimately became, she's an embalmer, which meant I spent time riding around in cars with dead bodies. So that was a whole experience. But point being, like, education kind of in different, you know, veins. And I do think, you know, one of the things that there were so many other women that I looked at, just like, you know, I had a whole spreadsheet of people that I was, you know, really trying to follow their trajectories. And it was hard to find unifying things. You know, education was kind of all over the board. Age was, I would say, between 20 into 50s. But there were also some, you know, people I looked at who've kind of gone silent in the last couple of years because they were more involved heavily in like the 80s and the 90s, and they're just tired. And so that's to say there is actually quite a bit of divergence. So on the one hand, I was kind of trying to, for my main subjects, to keep it like the frame somewhat small, but then the divergence was actually quite large. And I think, again, that points to what I was talking about with radicalization, where, you know, there's not some key determinant. It's not, you know, going to be where you came from. Education is certainly important here, but I think more so than some other factors. But did you come from a broken family? Did you have some terrible trauma? Were you divorced? Are you married now? Like any number of things, those are actually not very helpful things to look at, because everybody's radicalization trajectory is so idiosyncratic. And that makes the task of thinking about how we tackle radicalization incredibly daunting. But at the same time, it makes you realize that like we're talking about an individual ultimately, and how do we reach an individual? So that's the answer to
No need to apologize. Amazing. Can we say thank you again to our speakers and